Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
Hitler, Anecdotes, Myths, and Lies. A lucky gambler.
On the 1st of September 1939, a number of unanswered questions still faced Hitler and the German High Command. How would Britain and France react? What decision would American President Franklin Roosevelt take? Waiting for answers to these and other questions, Hitler addressed a meeting of Parliament at the Kroll Opera House. Speaking from the rostrum in a shrill voice, he announced that in the face of Polish intransigence, he had ordered the Wehrmacht to intervene. He finished his speech on a solemn note, saying, "We will be chivalrous in battle," and promised that women and children would be unharmed. However, in one of the Luftwaffe's first operations over Warsaw, a hospital for mentally handicapped children was destroyed.
(1939). The Long March of Hitler, which began on the 1st of September 1939, shook the foundations of the Western governments, particularly the British, which had led with its policy of appeasement attempts to check the ambitions of the Nazi leader. Conservative politicians like Winston Churchill called for a joint British-French attack on the German forces invading Poland, arguing that this would probably cause the collapse of Hitler and his regime. But the conservative Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain rejected this idea, naively insisting that the German troops should withdraw from Poland. His stance provoked sharp criticism and insults, even from the benches of his own party in the House of Commons.
His name upon it as well as mine.
The public outcry and rebellion in Parliament increased, and on the 3rd of September, the British government sent a telegram to its ambassador in Berlin, Neville Henderson, with instructions to meet the German Foreign Minister, von Ribbentrop, and deliver a declaration of war. Chamberlain proposed a government of national unity, with the Navy under Churchill, the man who had been warning about the rising power of Nazism for many of years. In France, meanwhile, some left and right-wing politicians, convinced German resources would soon run out, called on the government of Edward Daladier to reach an agreement with Hitler. The French leader ignored these calls, however, and declared war on Germany on the 3rd, a few hours after the British had done so. This time, Hitler had erred in his calculations, and for most of his army high command, the invasion of Poland and the European conflict that loomed represented an act of grave irresponsibility provoked by the impulsive dictator. The patience of the Western governments had run out, along with the luck that had accompanied the Nazi leader in his annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Those members of the Wehrmacht that had fought in the First World War feared the same mistakes were being made, and in many cases harbored doubts about the military and political capacity of Germany to win the war. This led Hermann Göring to offer to fly to London to try to reach an agreement with the British following their declaration of war, as the intelligence being provided by the secret services indicated that the war would spread throughout Europe, far beyond the repeated predictions of Hitler. At the same time, from Italy, Mussolini proposed a ceasefire and peace conference. However, in both cases, Hitler did not give his approval. The war was unstoppable, and the German forces had orders to occupy Poland in the shortest possible time. Meanwhile, at sea, the Battle of the Atlantic had begun. The leadership of the Kriegsmarine ordered attacks on enemy ships without warnings. On the 3rd of September, at 9 o'clock at night, a U-30, commanded by Fritz Julius Lemp, fired its torpedoes at the passenger liner Athenia after making it for a destroyer. The ship was sailing from Liverpool to Montreal with 1,103 civilians on board, of whom 333 were North Americans. After the attack, British destroyers rescued the survivors, but 128 people, including 28 Americans, lost their lives. Lemp was reprimanded by Hitler, who feared a repetition of the situation following the sinking of the Lusitania in 1917. Goebbels immediately got to work, spreading the idea in the press that the attack had been the work of the British to try to bring the United States into the war. But President Roosevelt was quick to declare on the radio that America would not enter the European war and would remain neutral. The British government, concerned about public opinion and morale at home following Roosevelt's announcement, ordered the first RAF bombing raid on the 4th of September against the German fleet in Kiel. The Nazis had shown themselves to be experts in psychological warfare, but the British believed this was the first battle that they must win. The British planes were to launch 120 million leaflets over big German cities, inciting the inhabitants to rise up and overthrow the tyrant Adolf Hitler. On the 14th of September, thousands of Jewish residents of Warsaw filled the synagogues to celebrate their new year, while the city was besieged by German troops. The Luftwaffe began the bombardments that were intended to flatten the city, making this day one of the bloodiest of the invasion. Admiral Canaris, chief of the Armed Forces Secret Service, received information of massacres by SS units in Poland and decided to speak about this with Hitler. When Hitler's train America arrived, Canaris first spoke with Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Army High Command. "Don't concern yourself with this subject," Keitel told Canaris. "And, for your own good, I advise you not to comment about it to the Führer." The Admiral heeded Keitel's advice, but traveling back to Berlin, he recalled Hitler's talk of chivalry in battle when addressing the Reichstag and felt disillusioned with the cause. He told his friend Karl Gordeler, the ex-mayor of Leipzig, of his feelings. "I am appalled by the acts of savagery which groups of our soldiers are committing against Polish people. Someone should stop what this madman has started." But the Führer was not willing to check the excesses of his soldiers. He had told the commander-in-chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch, that the Wehrmacht should not interfere under any circumstances in the operations of the SS. The executions of military personnel and civilians continued. In only 3 weeks, the forces of von Brauchitsch defeated the Polish army. Berlin and Moscow shared out between them a part of Europe. On the 1st of October, with a view to maintaining the purity of the Aryan race, what Hitler called mercy killings began. In a building in the suburbs of Berlin at number 4 Tiergartenstrasse, the euthanasia program given the secret name Action T4 was undertaken to put to death those judged by the Nazis as not having a life worth living. Christian Wirth, a member of the SS, also known as Christian the Savage, was put in charge. Those classified as mentally handicapped, especially small children and the newly born, were sent from all around Germany to the 6 centers designated for Operation T4. All of them, the most notorious for its cruel methods and the numbers killed, was the Hadamar Clinic in the north of the country, near the River Rhine. Three medical experts, following guidelines from the Ministry of Health, decided which patients merited life. The handicapped, the paralyzed, the mentally ill, and anybody suffering from a physical or mental defect, besides those considered to be not of Aryan blood, were sent to the T4 clinics to be killed by lethal injections or in the gas chambers. Afterwards, the bodies were incinerated or buried in mass graves. At the same time, German scientists were desperately investigating ways of increasing the destructive power of the armed forces. Hitler had given them a blank check in the hope that they would soon manufacture arms of mass destruction. On the 4th of October, the Führer was informed that nuclear fission could be used to make a bomb with immense destructive power. The news delighted the Nazi dictator, who dreamed of possessing a weapon which could give him the power to dominate the world. But the enemies of the Reich, who were well aware of these ambitions and of advances in research, swiftly leaked the news. The American economist Alexander Sachs requested an urgent meeting with President Roosevelt to show him the letter he had received from his friend Albert Einstein. In it, the German scientist stated that atomic energy could wipe out a city. An alarmed Roosevelt ordered preparations for the first conference on atomic energy in Washington.
We send forth our prayers and our hopes.
A month on from the start of the invasion, some German officers saw the barbaric policy of ethnic cleansing that was being carried out in Poland to be totally unacceptable. One of these was General Johannes Blaskowitz, who repeatedly complained to Hitler about the criminal activities of the SS in Poland. As a result, he was transferred and condemned to inactivity. Following the victory of Lightning War in Poland, the Nazi leader wanted to achieve his objective of the annihilation of the country's aristocracy, intellectuals, politicians, military leaders, and middle class. General Halder defined the policy thus: the Führer wants to convert the Polish into slave laborers. On the 5th of October, a vainglorious Hitler presided over the victory parade in Warsaw. A group of journalists selected by Goebbels were invited to the beautiful city, now in ruins. As he shook the hand of each of them, Hitler remarked, "Take note of the fate of Warsaw and communicate to the world that I can do the same with any European city." On the following day, Hitler made an offer of peace to France and Britain, but in both cases it was rejected. Chamberlain and Daladier replied that they would fight until the Nazi threat was eliminated. Shortly afterwards, Hitler, Göring, Goebbels, along with Heydrich and Admiral Canaris, who were in charge of espionage, decided to initiate Operation Bernhard, a huge fraud aimed at destabilizing the British economy. At the head of the operation, they placed an SS official named Bernhard Kruger with the mission of finding the best currency forgers to produce more than 150 million pounds, which were to be dropped on Britain from Luftwaffe planes in a number of stages. The plan failed. The forgers were Jews and deliberately delayed the work. The German invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland had resuscitated the French-British Entente of the First World War. The public in both countries opposed Hitler's territorial ambitions, and their leaders were terrified by the prospect of a European war, especially with the Mediterranean being in the hands of two pro-Nazi dictators. Hitler admired Mussolini, but considered Franco's regime was not on par with fascist Italy or National Socialist Germany. Franco can say what he likes, but his victory was not decided by God or his mother, but by the bombs dropped by von Richthofen's planes, Hitler commented to Keitel as he finalized the first plans to continue the war against France and Britain. On the 9th of October, Hitler met in Berlin with Birger Dahlhaus, the Swedish businessman and friend of Goering, who still continued to try to negotiate with the British government to reach an agreement to put an end to the conflict. The British insisted that Germany must return Poland its statehood and destroy its arms. Hitler replied, stating that he reserved the right to establish new frontiers, and what is more, demanded the return of Germany's pre-First World War colonies. The British were by now convinced that the Nazi leader wanted war. On the 3rd of November, the U.S. Congress, at the request of President Roosevelt, revoked the clause of the Neutrality Acts that since 1937 had prohibited the sending of American armaments to countries at war. In this way, the door was opened for France and Britain to buy armaments. Informed of the news, Hitler discussed with General von Brauchitsch the need to start the Western offensive as soon as possible, setting the start date for the 12th of November. But Brauchitsch argued that the German army was not ready, and in his view, the date was badly chosen, as rain could slow down the advance of the armored columns and the days were very short. Hitler decided von Brauchitsch was right and canceled the scheduled start date. When Wilhelm Keitel went to tell the general, he said, "Don't pay too much attention to his attitude. You know as well as I do that he is not a military man and lacks education and training, but he is convinced that he has revolutionized the art of war."
Los von Pape, Lorenz Stransky.
On the 8th of November, Hitler traveled to Munich to celebrate the 16th anniversary of the Putsch, which traditionally brought together the main figures in the party and Nazi regime in the Burger Braukeller beer hall. The 36-year-old Johann Georg Elser, who had worked in a watch factory where he acquired knowledge of how to make timers, was planning to kill Hitler. He placed his bomb close to the platform where Hitler was due to speak at the gathering. Hitler started to speak at 8:20 in the evening and finished at 9 o'clock, and then left the hall quickly as he was in a rush to get back to Berlin. Elser's bomb exploded at 9:20. 8 people were killed and 63 injured, but Hitler had escaped. Upon being informed of what had happened as he returned to Berlin by train, he exclaimed, "It is clear that Providence wants me to fulfill my mission." Himmler and Heydrich quickly created 2 SS investigation teams, but Elser was detained by chance at a customs post at Constanza on the Swiss frontier. The Gestapo tortured him, and on the 14th of November, he confessed to the bombing. Himmler was convinced he had been helped by the British Secret Service and the Black Front, led by the exiled Otto Strasser in Canada. This theory was never proved, however. Johann Georg Elser, who became known as Hitler's prisoner, was held in the concentration camps of Sachsenhausen and Dachau, where, on the 9th of April 1945, he was killed by a shot in the neck from the SS officer Theodor Heinrich. Hitler had started the war on Poland, convinced that fear and cowardice would prevent France and Britain from intervening. This error resulted in an Allied blockade, that caused a reduction of more than 80% in imports of the German war economy. But a mood of triumphalism reigned in Berlin, and the Führer urged his high command to begin as soon as possible the offensive against the West, outlined in his Directive No. 6 of October. Goebbels, however, perhaps the most astute of the Nazi leaders, feared the war would drag on and the country face great difficulties to supply its needs, such as raw materials for the manufacture of armaments. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were insufficient to satisfy the needs of the Nazi monster. The German High Command meticulously prepared the campaign against France. Hitler intended to take over parts of Holland, Belgium, and the north coast of France in order to launch from there his air and sea war against Britain. "The British will end up pleading to talk to us after we have thrashed them," he said. The Germans enjoyed superiority in the air and sea, and the British government was very worried about information it was receiving concerning the Third Reich's supposed new means of waging war. Churchill informed the War Cabinet that the Royal Navy had confirmed the Thames estuary was mined, and the Minesweeper Adventures had been destroyed by a mine which had caused the death of 12 members of its crew. British experts worked round the clock to find a way of counteracting what Churchill considered to be one of the secret weapons of the Nazis. On the 15th of November, the Führer summoned General Rommel, whom he considered an expert strategist following his actions in the Polish campaign. Hitler told him of the plans for the Western offensive, and in response to Rommel's complaints about the behavior of the SS in Poland, he replied evasively, "General, you should read Rosenberg more. Where there is no resistance, undertake a peaceful occupation, but in the case of resistance, destroy everything." On the 30th of November, in the face of the refusal of the Finns to give up their independence, the Red Army invaded the country and started the so-called Winter War. But the 500,000 men and thousands of tanks were not properly equipped to fight in Arctic conditions, where temperatures dropped to more than 40 degrees below zero and there was round-the-clock darkness. The Russians met fierce resistance on all fronts from a united people expert in fighting at low temperatures. Stalin only gained the Finnish part of Karelia and was forced to give up his wider ambitions in the region, afraid of becoming involved in the European war. The Western powers condemned the aggression, and the Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations. On the 22nd of December, the Russian dictator celebrated his 60th birthday. Hitler was in Munich with his friend Elsie Bruckmann, to whom he spoke of his plans to shortly destroy Britain and afterwards Russia. The Nazi leader nevertheless sent a telegram to Stalin wishing him a happy birthday and a long life. Some days later, the Nazi leader received a letter with a Swiss postmark from the industrialist Fritz Thyssen, who had supported Hitler in the first years of his government. It not only criticized the persecution of Jews and Christians, but also the pact with Stalin. Do not stoop to the same level as these criminals that have plunged Russia into the greatest disaster of its history, Thiessen wrote. But Hitler was not thinking of changing his policy. On the 30th of December, in a speech to the nation, he said, "Jewish capitalism will not survive the 20th century. We will see to that."
The initial plans for the invasion of Western Europe, of which Hitler had requested meticulous details, were drawn up by General Franz Halder, but they did not convince the commanders of the armored divisions. The Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht became bogged down in lengthy arguments until news broke of an aeroplane accident inside Belgium territory involving 2 German officers. It remains a mystery whether it was a genuine crash landing or an intentional landing that was made to look like an engine failure in order to provide information that would help the enemy to make preparations to stop Hitler.
(1940). Whatever the truth, the 2 German officers, Erich Hoensmans and Helmuth Reinberger, who were flying in a Messerschmitt Bf 108 Typhoon, came down on the 10th of January near the river Maas between the Belgian towns of Mechelen and Vught, where they were taken prisoner by the army. Inexplicably, the documents detailing air transport operations in Belgium and France, which they were carrying in a briefcase, were not destroyed. Despite the fact that some Belgian officials believed them to be false, the immediate mobilization of the Belgian and Dutch armies was ordered along the borders with Germany. This, and the poor weather conditions, led Hitler to again postpone the Western offensive, and the High Command resumed its arguments about the tactical plan. Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff of Army Group A, under the orders of von Rundstedt, had drawn up a plan consisting of a panzer advance through Luxembourg and the south of Belgium, crossing the Ardennes into France. Manstein asked for the opinion of expert colleagues, among them Heinz Guderian, who put the plan before the High Command. Hitler liked the idea so much, he made it his own, causing a jealous Halder to fervently back the project and give absolute priority to the Ardennes offensive. The intrigues of the High Command to obtain the Führer's favor led to Manstein, the author of the plan, being prevented from having any further input or significant role in the Western offensive. At the end of February, French, British, and Polish codebreakers began to decipher German messages using the Enigma machine. Meanwhile, Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, revealed his shortcomings as a strategist when he moved most of his troops northwards, away from the Ardennes, to concentrate on building fortifications in Belgium. By the start of April, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was convinced that the Allied blockade was beginning to affect the German economy. Hitler, he said, has missed the bus. However, contrary to what Chamberlain was thinking, Hitler's worries were occasioned more by Stalin's actions in the north of Europe. With the intention of preventing future actions by the Russians or the British in the region, he decided to occupy Norway and Denmark. On the 9th of April, the invasion began with only 9 divisions, and this economically important region was secured for the Reich. The British attempts to intervene in the Nordic countries failed, and they were forced to abandon their positions when on the 10th of May, at 5:35 in the morning, Germany's Great Western Offensive began. At 7 o'clock in the morning of the same day, the British received calls for help from Holland and Belgium. The under-fire Chamberlain and his cabinet, overwhelmed by circumstances, called on the opposition to form a government of national unity. Meetings between politicians and business leaders took place throughout the day and night. The labor leaders were reluctant to join the government with Chamberlain as its head. Most of the political leaders believed that the German army was strong enough to overrun Europe. Some believed the war was lost, and no one wanted to be head of a government that might be forced to negotiate a humiliating surrender and go down in history as the man that handed over the country to Hitler. For the labor politicians, there was only one possibility: Winston Churchill, the main critic of Neville Chamberlain. He had the character and the tenacity that was required, and this would be his great chance to cancel the debt he owed the country for the Gallipoli disaster of 1915. On the 11th of May, Churchill accepted the post of Prime Minister of a government which included representatives from all the main parties, and with himself as Minister of Defense. That afternoon, in his first cabinet meeting, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, sweat, and tears."
Single-handed to guard the rights of men.
Hitler, who felt a mixture of admiration, hate, and envy towards Britain, exclaimed upon hearing the news, "These British have put a drunkard at the head of their defeat." Meanwhile, the German Western Offensive was advancing rapidly. The French High Command, totally disorientated and confused, ordered General Henri Giraud to take charge of the 9th Army, situated on the Franco-Belgian border. On the 18th of May, after a long journey, he arrived at his command post in Wassigny, where he was met by German officers. "We are aware of your instructions," he was told. "But I am afraid, General, you have been unlucky. Your 9th Army has withdrawn, and we thought it would be a serious discourtesy on our part if we did not wait for you. You are our prisoner." Giraud was the first Allied general to fall into enemy hands. He was sent to Königstein prison, from where he managed to escape on the 17th of April, 1942. Rommel's troops that had crossed Belgium reached the river Mosa through Dinant, while Guderian's armored formations did so through Sedan. These were two of the most feared officers of the German army, after von Rundstedt, responsible for the famous sudden halt at Dunkirk, agreed to by Hitler on the 24th of May. On the 10th of June, seeing the triumphal march of the German armies towards the west, Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. Mightily proud of his decision, he sent a copy of the declaration to Hitler, who, upon receiving it, remarked to Keitel, "I have a special regard for this man, but I believe he was too cowardly to intervene at the start, and now it seems to me he is too anxious to get a share of the spoils." Following the Italian decision, Churchill and the French Prime Minister Paul Renault believed it was a good moment to seek public support from the United States, but Roosevelt would not be drawn into the European war. The American president claimed he was doing everything possible to increase the supply of armaments, but his hands were tied by the Neutrality Acts. Nevertheless, he came up with a plan to send planes to Britain without violating the law. This involved flying U.S. planes to the border with Canada, where they were pushed across the border by Canadians. From there, they were flown to Newfoundland and embarked legally for Britain. The arrival of these U.S. planes helped to raise British morale and increase confidence in ultimate victory. Such was Churchill's own belief in this, that when the director of the National Gallery requested permission to move the gallery's most valuable paintings to Canada, the Prime Minister told him to store them in the basement and not to doubt that the country would prevail. On the 14th of June, however, German soldiers entered Paris, watched by distraught residents. At this time, Charles Howard, the Earl of Suffolk, and his secretary Eileen Marden undertook a daring mission to smuggle out of France 50 scientists and 26 barrels of heavy water used in atomic research. They embarked on the coal ship the Broom Park, and after a stormy crossing, arrived at Falmouth in the southwest of England. On the afternoon of the 16th of June, the French Prime Minister, Paul Renault, stood down. His replacement, the aging Marshal Pétain, immediately asked the Spanish ambassador in France to initiate contacts with the Germans in order to bring about an armistice. Hitler, who was at his headquarters at Brûlé-des-Pêches, close to the Belgian-French border, when he received the news, slapped his thigh for joy, a gesture that Goebbels' propaganda would make famous. On Friday, the 21st of June, Hitler's revenge was complete. He ordered the armistice to be signed in the same railway carriage in which the German generals had capitulated to the Allies in 1918, and which the French had kept as a symbol of their victory. Once more, the carriage was brought to the same forest clearing on a railway track in the forest of Compiègne, to where the French representatives came from Bordeaux. The German leader, exultant and silent, listened as Keitel read out the terms of the armistice. Once that was done, to express his scorn for the defeated enemy, Hitler left. The negotiations continued throughout the day of the 22nd, and as evening approached, an irritated Keitel shouted, "I'll give you 1 hour to agree to our terms. If you don't, you will be sent to the French lines, and we will continue the occupation." The French asked to speak with their government in Bordeaux by telephone, and shortly after signed the armistice. It was 6:50 on the 22nd of June, 1940, and with France, the number of countries that had succumbed to Germany in less than 9 months was now 6. On the 23rd of June, Hitler made his first and only visit to Paris. The architect Albert Speer headed the committee with 2 expert guides organized to show the Führer the most emblematic points of the beautiful city. Hitler was moved at seeing the Opera House, the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, and many other monuments, but none impressed him as much as Les Invalides by the River Seine, which housed Napoleon's tomb. Hitler and his entourage remained some minutes in silence by the tomb, with bowed heads. Later, the Führer commented that, due to his great admiration and respect for Napoleon, he would not order the transfer of his remains to Berlin, and as an homage to his memory, ordered the remains of his son, the Duke of Reichstadt, to be brought from Vienna and placed with those of his father. "Today is one of the best days of my life," the German leader exclaimed as he toured the city. The party paused to admire the view on the Champs-Élysées. In front of the Eiffel Tower, Hitler praised the beauty of Paris and told Speer, "You and I are going to make Berlin much more beautiful than this city. It won't be necessary to destroy it, because when Berlin is finished, this city will be insignificant." The world was shaken by the rapid defeat of France. A nation and an army that had been victorious in the First World War, but had nevertheless yielded to the German armed forces in only 1 month. For the British Prime Minister, the problem had been a military one. France had not learned the terrible lessons of 1914, and successive governments had failed to sufficiently rearm, while the generals continued to base their plans on the idea of a defensive war. "125,000 soldiers died in just over 5 weeks due to the inability of their leaders. Among these were General Maurice Gamelin, more of an intellectual than a military man, and General Maxime Weygand, both of whom tried to cover up their own incompetence with fine-sounding words that only made defeat more bitter." However, for Charles de Gaulle, who had escaped to London, France was not alone. His speeches from the BBC called on the French not to lose hope. "We have lost a battle, but not the war," he said. "We can count on the enormous support of the British Empire and the industrial resources of the United States. Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not and shall not go out. De Gaulle had taken up residence in a small property provided by the British government. Very soon, his pride and arrogance led him to assume the role of representative of his country in exile. His proclamations and writings aimed at encouraging the French to fight for their liberation earned him a certain renown, which he skillfully used to gain recognition as head of government in exile from the British. Roosevelt ignored him, and Churchill could not bear him. With his haughty attitude, and without at this time clearly representing anything or anybody, he turned up everywhere. The British Prime Minister even thought about expelling him from the country, but with his characteristic sense of humor, he told Parliament there was no way of getting rid of him or of shutting him up, and so he suggested cutting off supplies to obtain the prompt surrender of the free French.
To collaborate in his designs.
However, the rapid German victory over France encouraged all those inside and outside Churchill's cabinet who were opposed to prolonging the war. The foreign minister, Lord Halifax, headed a movement that sought to reach agreement with Germany.
You are asked to give your help. I have no power to compel you.
At the end of July, the American ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, told President Roosevelt that any further intervention in the conflict was not worthwhile, as Britain could not withstand a German attack, and along with its empire was destined to disappear. Roosevelt chose to ignore Kennedy's advice and supported Churchill's decision to sink the Vichy French fleet. On the 3rd of July, the British undertook Operation Catapult, a plan to disable the French ships moored in the Algerian port of Mer el Kebir. Part of the British fleet took up position facing the coast and called for the unconditional surrender of all the ships. When this was refused, the British unleashed a bombardment that lasted for 5 minutes and destroyed the cruisers Dunkirk, Provence, and Bretagne, causing the death of 1,200 sailors, but obtaining the desired capitulation. Churchill justified the action in Parliament, saying it was for the nation and its American allies to judge what had been done, and if not, then the world and history would do.
President Roosevelt viewed the Prime Minister's decision as a demonstration of the courage with which the British were confronting the situation, and looked for new ways of providing more help to Britain. It wasn't easy, however, as he had his hands tied by the policy of non-intervention, which was strongly defended by important figures like Joseph Kennedy, the US ambassador to Britain, and the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who had publicly expressed sympathy for the Nazi regime.
History came to me and said, pick your 10 best mysteries and let's find them. We'll give you researchers, we'll give you the resources, you have to solve it. You have to work hard, you have to work fast. The clock we know is ticking against us. It's going to require everything we have to actually find the answers. At the end result, we're going to get truth in a way that nobody's seen before.
היסטוריה מוצפנת, שבת ב-5:10 בערוץ ההיסטוריה. בפסח, טל ברמן יוצא למשימה לאומית ומגלה את ישראל חפץ אחר חפץ ופריט אחר פריט שהיו חלק בלתי נפרד מחיי המדינה ואזרחיה.
אולי בן גוריון עצמו ישב על הכיסא.
שמע, זה כבוד גדול.
גלגל הסרט המקורי של השידור הראשון בטלוויזיה בישראל. מיקרופון מראשית ימי כל ישראל. נעלי גולדה שאנחנו כל כך מחפשים נמצאים אצלך.
לא זכרתי קודם את הכותרת, המנדט מת, תחי מדינתנו.
זה אי אפשר לתאר.
עוצרים את המדינה בקרוב בערוץ ההיסטוריה.
People in ancient times were visited by beings not from this earth.
Every civilization have been in touch with extraterrestrial beings.
India, Israel, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. It's some kind of doorway between our dimension and another.
חייזרים מן העבר, עונה שנייה, שלישי ב-9:20, בערוץ ההיסטוריה.
You have to ask yourself, are we missing part of the story?
1847 נולד אלכסנדר גרם בל. 1876 הומצא מכשיר הטלפון. עכשיו, ערוץ ההיסטוריה אצלכם בנייד. הסדרות המובילות והאירועים ההיסטוריים הכי חשובים במכשיר הסלולרי שלכם. ההיסטוריה מתרחשת בכל יום ובכל מקום.
I'm not expecting, I'm demanding.
I was doing push-ups at